one. And we're running. So Dr. Pran, thank you very much for coming on the podcast with me, mate. I feel very privileged to have someone with your expertise, credentials, and knowledge on for a chat. So the only thing I've been nervous about all week is if I pronounce this right. So we are a gastroenterologist.
That's right, mate. Sometimes shortened to gastro. They call us gastros.
So, mate, for those that are unfamiliar with that line of work, and for my own understanding as well, can you give us a little bit of insight into, I suppose, the common issues that you're sort of dealing with daily, why you think or the prevalence of these things increasing within our society, and I guess why we think that's happening to begin with?
No worries, Jack. So as a gastroenterologist, our specialty entails the human gut, basically. But it's an interesting specialty because it also encompasses some of the organs that are related to the human gut, so i.e. the digestive tract. So we look at diseases of not just the esophagus, stomach, midgut, and the colon, but also organs like the liver, the pancreas, the bile duct, the gallbladder. All of these systems are kind of tied in with digestion, basically. So you could look at us as doctors of digestion. And I guess our line of work now primarily is dealing with diseases related to digestion. And I think a lot of them, as you said, the rates are increasing of these diseases. You know, we're talking reflux and irritable bowel and and all these sort of erratic bowel habits that we have. A lot of it, I think, relates to the food environment in which we exist. And it makes sense, right? Like what we're putting in is kind of stuffing the function of the digestive tract, which, believe it or not, a lot of people, even in our line of work, fail to appreciate. So when we were initially trained, it's this concept of irritable bowel. Well, that's kind of just who they are and the way they're born. It's more than that. It's the environment and how do we tackle the environment. So that's always been my perspective, and that's my approach to how I deal with my clients.
Yeah, sure, man. So essentially we're looking at basically the entire channel from the time something enters our mouth and basically until it leaves our body. But as you mentioned there, and it's sort of been becoming more commonly discussed and almost popularized, is the understanding that the gut and the brain, for example, have got such a connection, the gut and our skin, and also some other organs that you mentioned there in regards to the liver and the pancreas particularly, which is obviously very, I suppose, their demand is very influenced by what we choose to eat.
Absolutely. And Jack, they talk of the gut-brain connection. And I think as these gut diseases become more prevalent and people realize how much it impacts their mental health when the gut's not working well, it's become a big thing, the gut-brain axis. But it may be interesting for your viewers or listeners to understand that 3.5 billion years ago, there was no brain. These ancient organisms that existed in the ocean or in the primordial soup, there was only the enteric nervous system, the gut-based nervous system. Enteric basically means gut. And at some point, these two systems separate and we start developing a nervous system that is separate to the enteric nervous system. So it becomes the central nervous system, which now makes up our brain and spinal cord. So the critical thing to understand, a lot of these neurotransmitters that run the enteric nervous system, i.e. the gut, signaling tissue, also are the same things that run the brain, such as dopamine, noradrenaline, GABA. And in fact, the interesting thing is 90% of our dopamine, our feel-good neurotransmitter, is found in our gut. 10% of it is found in our central nervous system. So it's talked of as this mysterious link, but really it's very simple. You look at it from an evolutionary perspective and go, well, at some point the two were connected, and that's always been my approach to things. View it from an evolutionary lens, and everything kind of makes sense from that.
And I think that's what has led us to, I suppose, getting on this chat today, is that we view things through a similar lens, and we've got some mutual connections that also push similar messages. But, you mentioned, dopamine there and it being built and present in the gut. And I think that's still quite a foreign understanding for people that aren't medically or nutritionally trained in understanding that, okay, how does a brain chemical, what's the gut actually got to do with that? But I've always explained to people that they're not hardwired, they're just always there. They're getting used up, they get detoxified, if you will, and they need to be replaced. And that requires micronutrients. It also requires amino acids. So dopamine being the pleasure center of the brain, but also that neurotransmitter that's responsible for us to be motivated, driven, I suppose, have good mood. We require tyrosine, one of the building blocks, and the amino acids they're found in animal protein. So we can see that in this modern Western diet, I think if we could summarize that, I'm sure you would agree that we're under eating protein, eating the wrong types of fats, and probably eating way too much refined carbohydrate and sugar, which doesn't leave probably enough micronutrient density or amino acid availability within that diet to, I suppose, enzymatically support the body and obviously our cognitive function and brain.
Yeah, well said, Jack. I mean, I couldn't have said it better, to be quite frank. People have this perspective that the human body is always a human body and just functions as some sort of closed circuit. It's not. It's very much an open circuit that communicates directly with the environment. Eating is such it's such an emotive thing for people now, right? Like, we're in the middle of these diet wars where we've got factions developing that are saying animal source protein's bad, and then there are other groups saying plant source protein is what we should be doing. So very, very confusing environment. I tend to look at eating as simply energy transfer, number one, and nutrient transfer. This is like, if you ask the question, what is the meaning of life? From a non-philosophical perspective, the meaning of life is really just transfer of nutrients from one system to another. The sun receives, as the plants receive sun's energy, they convert it to nutrients and energy. They then transfer it to animals that consume the plants. Then there are other animals that consume the animals, and we consume the animals. And that's kind of how that cycle goes. But, people think that they can consume this modern food that's all around us and nutrient wise support the body. That's impossible to do. We evolved in an era where nutrients were scarce, but the food sources in which we got it from was extremely dense, right? And so this is the thing, and if you could tie exercise into that, because nutrients were scarce, we had to forage and we had to hunt it. So it's constantly moving to find these valuable sources. And as humans, we were adept at knowing which sources were nutrient dense, and we knew what foods to go for. But in this modern world, we're completely confused as to what to go for. I mean, you could talk to a CEO of a multi-million-dollar business, say, and you say, what do you do for breakfast? And they'll say, well, I eat Weet-Bix with some skim milk. And you say to them, well, what does that actually support? And they're unable to tell you that. So it shows you how far we've become removed from the very thing that fuels us, right? I think what fueled humanity is essentially the pursuit of food. Our brains developed because we needed more and more and more energy. It was this beautiful cycle that we entered into. But now we're in this environment where capitalism drives everything. We kind of forget what we need to do to actually fuel the body, which is eat well and move well, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it does. It makes perfect sense. I mean, I always choose my words really carefully when, I suppose, consulting on the topic of calories, so to speak, given that with my demographic, I'm dealing with a large percentage of younger and middle-aged females that have this fear of food because they've been told eat more, move less, eat more. Hang on, I'm getting that around the wrong way still. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Eat less, move more for such a long time, and that avoidance and calorie counting is their solution to their health or composition goals. But when you're eating, low nutrient density foods that have been, refined and processed, then that has a little bit more relevance. But we want to actually encourage people to be eating more of the good food and probably putting those scales and calorie calculators away a little bit, because again, if you choose to eat foods that were provided to us by Mother Nature, and we can start to establish that emotional connection again, rather than just being in this modern consume, well, you're going to remove a lot of those calorie issues that you're facing with in the first place, because it's not really a daily caloric intake that we're looking at anyway. If we're looking at metabolic function, we're probably more looking across your entire month and dividing that by, let's say, 30. But we look at the energy and effort it takes to consume a Mars bar versus 400 grams of sweet potato, for example. And we've got a very similar carbohydrate intake there, but then the quality of those nutrients are obviously very, very different. And we don't have to be a rocket scientist to imagine that if you had a clone version of yourself eating the same macronutrients over 2 months or 3 months, but one of you was getting them from Whole Foods and the other was getting them from Mars bars and protein shakes, you're probably not going to look the same, feel the same, and perform the same at the end of that time period. So I think that's a really important factor, which just adds another layer of complexity for the, I suppose, general population and consumer. Like, it's no wonder they're confused, because food quality really matters. And you explained that, I suppose, food chain that we exist in. And that is kind of a consequence that sits at the top there, is that we take on the foods that our food ate. So when we're eating shit quality produce as well, let's say it even is chicken, but it's been fed antibiotics and fed grains and soy or whatever it may be, that then bypasses into the human body and has a pretty detrimental effect from an inflammatory point of view. And I'm sure you can tell me a little bit more about how that looks internally in the GI tract.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just to touch on that topic, we often look at eating as dieting as it is a battle of willpower, right? Like, that's how the modern human looks at it. Well, I'm going to try and lose weight. It's going to be a willpower thing. What myself and our team of dietitians and doctors actually try and teach people is how to do it intuitively, how to eat intuitively, eat when you're hungry. And really, our bodies are pretty amazing. I think when we deliver the right nutrients, in particular amino acids, to our bodies, to our digestive tract, we've got inbuilt mechanisms to sense that, as in there are satiety factors that are immediately triggered. And I think this is
talking about things like ghrelin and leptin and stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Ghrelin, leptin, they're all tied in insulin. They're all hormones that kind of go up and down, and they're kind of very much interrelated. And there are possibly other mediators that we don't even know and we don't even quite understand. But what I do realize is this, and I talk about it a lot, is the concept of protein leverage hypothesis, that fundamentally, if you're low in quality protein or bioavailable protein, right? And often bioavailable protein is found in animal source foods. You can find it in plant source foods. It's just very, very difficult for us to access as humans because of the issues related to the fibrous matrix that it's tied into and the anti-nutrients. So if we're looking at it from, well, there's a protein target to hit for an organism or for an animal. If that protein target's not met, you're constantly hungry. And so it does become a battle of willpower then to lose weight, because you're surrounded by an energy-rich environment. It's a very elegant hypothesis called the protein leverage hypothesis, devised in 2005 by actually an Australian scientist. So I think that kind of encompasses the issue that we've got. Really, if you're eating a diet that is extremely nutrient dense, things like sweet potatoes, things like, red meat, which is a very, very nutrient dense source of nutrient dense protein, you'll find that you're just not as hungry, you're not snacking as often, and that is the key factor. I'm a big disbeliever in this whole carbohydrate insulin model. We get people in the low carbohydrate world saying, well, we're eating carbohydrates and insulin's going up, that's the issue. It's not. It's we're eating low satiety foods, having to snack constantly. That's pushing the insulin up. That's the area under the curve that we've got to look at, rather than carbohydrates are the issue. The problem being with carbohydrates is most of the modern carbohydrates are really low satiety, and that's the issue. Just to touch on one interesting thing, I think there was a little experiment that was put up where a chap ate nothing, a quite overweight chap ate nothing but white potatoes for about a year and lost 100-something kilos, and he was fundamentally healthier at the end of that project. So we're looking at it from a calorie perspective, that he was consuming a monotonous amount of calories every day from a monotonous source, and lost weight. But what's the long-term picture there, right? He's essentially powered his body with the fat stores that he's had. That is an indefinite, you can't do that indefinitely. he can't do that for 3-4 years, because you start running into issues with significant nutrient deficiencies, and you start tapping into muscle and bone to kind of liberate amino acids that our body needs for turnover. So it's really about teaching people, well, it's not about